Sergeant First Class Eddie Morales adjusted his worn dress blues one final time, the fabric taut against his shoulders despite its age. At 68, his silver hair gleamed under his green beret, and the morning sun caught the faded ribbons pinned to his chest. Each step toward Riverside Memorial Chapel was deliberate, his arthritis a quiet reminder of years past. His posture, though, remained military straight, a testament to decades of discipline. In his left hand, he clutched a weathered black and white photo. In his right, a simple wooden cane steadied his stride. The funeral home, nestled in an upscale part of town, exuded wealth with its manicured gardens and marble columns. Today, it hosted the funeral of General Patricia Hawkins, a decorated three-star general who had passed away the previous week. Eddie had read about her death in the local newspaper, her name sparking a flood of memories. 2 buses and a 6-block walk had brought him here, driven by a deep need to pay his respects. He had served 3 tours in Vietnam as a Special Forces medic from 1973 to 1978, joining the Army straight out of high school in Detroit, seeking purpose. During his second tour, near the Cambodian border, his unit was ambushed. Under heavy enemy fire, Eddie crawled through mud and chaos for 40 minutes, dragging 7 wounded soldiers to safety. The Army awarded him the Silver Star, but he always said the real heroes didn't make it home. After the war, nightmares and survivor's guilt haunted him. He worked as a hospital orderly for 30 years, never married, and lived quietly in a downtown apartment. His military service defined him, though he rarely spoke of it. Each morning, he folded his flag as he'd been taught in basic training. Each evening, he read letters from the families of soldiers he'd saved, letters that kept him anchored through the darkest times. As Eddie approached the funeral home entrance, a young security guard, barely 25 with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit blocked his path. "Excuse me, sir, this service is invitation only. I need you to step aside." The guard's tone was sharp, his eyes scanning Eddie's faded uniform with disdain. Behind him, the funeral director, a thin man in his 50s, nodded approvingly at the security measures. Well-dressed attendees in designer clothes breezed past Eddie without a glance, their confident strides marking them as the invited elite. Eddie tried to explain his connection to General Hawkins, but the guard cut him off. "You might be confused, sir. Maybe you're thinking of a different funeral." The condescension in his voice grew with each word. Others began to stare, whispering about the old man causing a scene. A news reporter filming outside noticed the commotion and approached with her camera crew. The funeral director stepped forward, his voice polite but firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before we call the police." The morning air felt heavy with judgment. Eddie's face burned, not with shame for himself, but for what this moment revealed about how society treated its veterans. He thought of the soldiers he'd saved, wondering if they'd face the same dismissal. His grip tightened on the photo, a 1975 snapshot of him and Lieutenant Patricia Hawkins, then just 22, fresh from West Point. The memory surged back, her voice on the radio during that ambush, steady and clear, coordinating evacuation helicopters as bullets tore through the air. She stayed on the ground until every wounded soldier was loaded, refusing to leave until Eddie signaled the all clear. They'd saved lives together that day, her tactical brilliance, his medical skill. After the war, they'd exchanged letters. She wrote of her resolve to change how the military treated its people, especially veterans. Her words had been a lifeline for Eddie in those early dark years back home. Now, standing outside her funeral, he felt the familiar weight of isolation. The same sting he'd felt when protesters spat on him at the airport, when employers overlooked him because of his service, when strangers looked through him as if he didn't exist. He wondered if Patricia would have approved of this exclusion. The answer was clear. She'd have been furious. Eddie stepped back and crossed the street to a bench, where he could still see the entrance but stay out of the way. More dignitaries arrived in black limousines, their dress uniforms glittering, with ribbons and stars. He recognized faces from television, politicians, military brass. A small group of protesters gathered at the corner, their signs decrying military spending, their chants an uncomfortable backdrop to the solemn event. The news crew interviewed high-profile mourners, who delivered polished statements about the general's legacy. Eddie watched, frustration mounting, as the narrative was shaped by people who likely never faced combat. A police officer approached his bench, mentioning a report of a suspicious man watching the funeral. Eddie explained his situation, and the officer, a veteran himself, listened intently. He suggested Eddie call the funeral home directly. Borrowing the officer's phone, Eddie tried, but the response was the same. Invitation only, no exceptions. As the service neared, Eddie spotted a familiar face among the arriving dignitaries. A colonel from Vietnam, once investigated for abandoning his men during a firefight. That man walked into the funeral with full honors, while Eddie, who had risked everything, sat across the street. The injustice burned, but something urged him to stay, to trust this wasn't the end. As the service began, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up. Out stepped General Marcus Sullivan, a four-star general with silver hair and a chest full of decorations, his presence commanding quiet authority. The security guard stopped him briefly, checking his invitation with exaggerated respect. Sullivan's eyes caught Eddie's across the street, something in the old soldier's posture drawing his attention. Excusing himself from his aide, he walked directly to Eddie, ignoring the puzzled looks from others. "What's your name, soldier?" he asked, his voice steady but warm. Eddie introduced himself and shared his story, showing Sullivan the photo of him and Lieutenant Hawkins. The general's expression shifted. He'd served under Hawkins later in her career and knew her stories, including one about a special forces medic who saved 7 men in a single day. Recognition dawned in his eyes. Without a word, Sullivan turned and strode back to the entrance, stopping before the security guard and funeral director. His voice carried across the street, calm but unyielding. "Sergeant Morales is my personal guest. Anyone with a problem can take it up with me." The change was instant. The guard stammered apologies. The funeral director scrambled to accommodate. Sullivan walked beside Eddie, matching his slower pace, and guided him to a front row seat reserved for distinguished guests. During the eulogy, Sullivan took the podium, his voice filling the room. He recounted the day Lieutenant Hawkins and Sergeant Morales saved lives under fire, describing Eddie's courage and Patricia's leadership. "True honor," he said, "isn't measured by rank or status, but by actions when no one's watching, by courage when everything's on the line." The audience sat in silence, absorbing the weight of his words. When he finished, Sullivan called Eddie forward, presenting him with a commemorative flag that had flown over the Pentagon. "This," he said, "is what a real American hero looks like." The funeral director, who had once threatened to call the police, now shook Eddie's hand with respect. Attendees approached, thanking him for his service, some apologizing for their earlier indifference. The news crew, which had ignored him before, now sought an interview, but Eddie declined. "Today isn't about me," he said softly. At the cemetery, Sullivan stood beside Eddie as they honored their fallen comrade. The general arranged for Eddie to ride back to town in a military vehicle, ensuring he returned home with dignity. Before parting, Sullivan handed Eddie his card. "Call if you ever need anything," he said. "We take care of our own." That evening, in his small apartment, Eddie sat at his kitchen table, the folded flag beside the old photo. He thought of Patricia, how she'd have laughed at the absurdity of the guest list debacle. The day had reminded him that dignity wasn't bestowed, it was carried within, earned through sacrifice. Sometimes, it took someone like Sullivan to make others see it. Eddie realized respect for veterans shouldn't hinge on connections or appearances. It should be a given, woven into society's fabric. He wrote a letter to Patricia's family, sharing memories of their time in Vietnam and thanking them for raising someone who embodied duty and honor. He promised to honor her by living with those same principles, caring for fellow soldiers no matter what. As he sealed the letter, Eddie felt seen again, valued for who he was and what he'd done. Tomorrow, he'd return to his quiet life, but something had shifted. The weight of isolation felt lighter, replaced by a quiet pride that no one could take away.